In this section, we'll be talking about symbolic practices. When we think about symbolic practices, these can include things like play, art, myth, ritual, religion, as well as worldview. When we think about play, we can think about this as a framing or orienting context that is, first, consciously adopted by the players. They want to play, they recognize that they are playing. It is somehow pleasurable for the people involved, and it's systematically related to what is non-play, by alluding to the non-play world, and also by transforming objects, roles, actions, and relations of ends and means characteristics of the non-play world. Play relies on the openness of language and cognition that permits diverse ways of talking and thinking, which also extends to how humans behave, things such as playing. Now, Fagan has observed the following things about play. First, it requires fit individuals. That is, if someone's not feeling really well, they're not too likely to be out playing or having a good time. You can think about this when you've been sick or feeling ill in the past, not necessarily wanting to play as much as you would otherwise. Fagan also observes that it is also utilized to develop skills used later in life for things such as hunting, fighting, or running. Play may function to develop cognitive and motor skills as well as to signify well-being to others. When we think about play, play does require two types of meta-communication. And we talk about meta-communication, we mean basically communication about the process of communicating itself. One of these is framing, where you place a cognitive boundary or message that marks certain behavior as play or as ordinary life. And so a couple examples of this from the non-human world, if you have any canines, dogs that you play with, you can readily recognize when they're playing with you. They have this sort of play face, they're nipping at you, but they're not really biting, and same thing with other dogs. So it's not really an aggressive sort of thing. Now, we humans have things like smiling to indicate let's pretend, or in a soccer game or other sport game, you have a referee's whistle to indicate the start or the end of play, or the pause of play. You also have different tones of voice to know when someone is kidding around or perhaps more serious. When we think about different forms of art, there are many different forms of art. We think about sculpture, painting, drawing, dance, theater, music, literature, film, photography, miming even. We can think about mass media productions, Hollywood films as art, oral narratives, oral traditions, storytelling, oral histories as art, spoken word, different types of festivals as art, and as well as national celebrations, such as things like the 4th of July or St. Patrick's Day, or potlatching, perhaps even. When I think about art, can be defined, the artistic form refers to the rules that art was created by. So you have things like a painting, which is, a painting's features two-dimensional, using paint on wood, canvas, or paper as the rules of art. However, the actual form can be played with and altered. You have multimedia expressions. But what art really comes down to is whether it's aesthetically successful. And by being aesthetically successful, we mean not only that you might like something, but you might also really not like something. So you have some sort of response to this, whether it's a positive, oh, I really like that, or it's a really negative response, I really hate that. What you don't want in art is something that you just feel completely ambivalent about, completely neutral. I couldn't care one way or the other. So when you think about the category of art, you have to think about how this is created and how this is thought about. Art objects, or the process of creating art, is centered around cultural values. Artwork can be a way of maintaining a particular social order. If you think about different sponsorship for art and art exhibits, and how this can lead to the recreation of a particular form and style of art that has embedded in it particular messages about the social order to reinforce the social order. When we think about so-called primitive art sold in global art markets, Arrington points out, were these objects ever really intended to be art? And Arrington breaks art into different categories of art by intention, where the artist had initially conceived or thought about as creating a piece of art, versus art by appropriation, somebody else looking at it and saying, hey, wow, that's a really great piece, let's include that in our art exhibit. Of course, art, like play, may present an alternative reality to its particular audience. And in the world of art, as well as other symbolic practices, today you have issues of ownership and copyright. And the idea of unique authenticity, or that the individual has made their own imprint on a particular object. And that is really at the individual or a specific group of individuals who have made this effort. And Bing and Ho talks about this idea of unique and authenticity as a founding myth of modern concepts of authorship as well as copyright law. Asking the question, who owns cultural products, and is there such a thing as collective creation as well as collective ownership? Looking at the context in Bolivia, the Bolivian copyright law, the emphasis in Bolivia, as in many areas, is on the individual or individuals, not on a group or collective rights. If as a group of anonymous or unknown musicians, then the piece becomes part of a national patrimony, which is simply owned by the state. There are arguments to have a collective indigenous entity take ownership of those particular rights. There's been a lot of work done by anthropologists looking at intellectual property rights for indigenous peoples. In the art context as well, it's also a matter of power as far as who can make claims to say what is art, what is an acceptable form of art. And Weingart talks about this in the piece Cultural Sovereignty in a Global Art Economy, Egyptian Cultural Policy and the New Western Art Interest in Art from the Middle East. And notes that the real rise in interest in art from the Middle East happened after 9/11, and so Egypt becomes a site of interest to so-called Westerners, Europeans as well as Americans, who are looking to expand the Egyptian art market and indeed make it a global art market. So art in the Western sense, again, we can think about this as individuals acting independently of anyone else with a focus or an emphasis on pure aesthetics. Does it have a positive or negative response? Does it elicit some sort of response in the audience? And the Western curators in this ethnographic example in Egypt deny any sort of economic interest in this, that they're merely looking to the international standards of what should constitute true art. And these standards are viewed by many Egyptians as justification for market exploitation. This is really wrapped into a whole notion of development, development coming from the outside, bringing outsiders in to modernize the art market in Egypt and to globalize it. And we think about this in the modernist ideology wrapped around these notions of development and continuous progress. That these pastoral and folk scenes that were previously really popular in Egyptian art are also looked to as sort of these timeless embodiments of a unique Egyptian qualities, an Egyptian authenticity. Art can also be thought about in the context of nationalistic projects, visual representation of a modernizing socialist nation. That is, this is where we're planning on going. Well, the interesting thing that came about in some of the development was this notion of modernization, and what you see in Egypt, a really pretty unique phenomena with the arrival of European and American curators, is the presence of English-only galleries, previously non-existing in the area, to cater really to outsiders, cosmopolitan individuals who speak English. Also, the idea of assistance. In the whole process here, we have a lack of consultation with even the National Museum in Egypt. There's a symposium which is held, and basically these outside experts come in, and rather than enter into any sort of dialogue with the Egyptians about how the museum should be set up, they start talking about this is what you need to do today in order to modernize your museum. Another form of symbolic practice is the idea of myth. And myths are stories whose truth seems self-evident because they do such a good job of integrating personal experiences with a wider set of assumptions about the way society or the world in general must operate. Myths are really a way of maintaining stability and regularity of acceptable assumptions about how the world works. They answer the important questions like where we are from, where we're going, and where we are right now. So it really helps to explain the entire history and events of a given people. Myths also can act as safeguards against overly open and creative interpretations of lived experience that may actually have disruptive consequences to the given social order, and that myths are often told by the ruling class as a way of upholding a general, uniform understanding of the past as well as the future. Myths can be codified into standard interpretations of a society's origins or philosophy. Malinowski looked at myths as a charter for social action, and he believed that myths function as explanations for the current social arrangement, and that any changes to the social order are in fact challenging the legitimacy of the myth. So for the myths of the Trobriand Islanders, social history for them began with a woman and her brother, central to membership to a clan and the rights of property, with the kinship ties going through the female line. Myth acts as a confirmation of why the society operates in this particular way. Also in the Trobriand context, you have a ranking of different members by levels of prestige. And so you have the dog and the pig clans. At first, the dog was of a higher status, so the myth was that the dog emerged from the earth first before the pig, so the dog clan had a higher status. However, when the pig clan started to rise in prominence, you start to see a new myth, and that is that although the dog emerged first and had a higher status than the pig, the dog ate something that it shouldn't have eaten. It ate a taboo food, which would lower the overall dog clan status, and then the pig, serves as an explanation for why the pig has a higher status. We talk about myth, and we can also talk about the notion of ritual. And rituals have four characteristics about them. First, they're repetitive social practice composed of a sequence of symbolic activities in the form of dance, song, speech, gestures, or the manipulation of objects. Second, they are set off from social routines of everyday life. Third, they adhere to culturally defined ritual schema. That is, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens in ordered sort of progress, and a sort of rote memory of how things progress or in the context of a ritual. It's also closely connected to a specific set of ideas that are often encoded in myth. If you think about rituals in the context of a university, of course, we can think about the graduation, and that people who perform these different rituals assert the authorization comes from outside themselves. So in the context of things like a graduation, you would have university representatives talk about the statewide system and how this gives them the authority to bestow or confer a degree. The same thing in the context of a marriage. You can have both state sanctions as well as religiously sanctioned, sometimes in the same ceremony, where you have an individual, a priest perhaps, taking authority of both the state as well as society as a whole, as well as the divine. A ritual has a text, which is a particular sequential ordering of acts, utterances, or different events which actually happen, the schema that it follows. In the context of rites of passage, which are in some ritual contexts, you have a ritual. Rites of passage can be defined as a ritual that serves to mark the movement and transformation of an individual from one social position to another. And the major theorist who wrote about this is Van Gennep, who in 1960 noted that most rituals followed a similar structure and created a theory of three ritual stages. First, a period of separation, where the ritual participant abandons their previous position. So they're a child, they're abandoning their previous position. A period of transition, wherein the participant goes through a process or ideal that puts the person in an ambiguous position. That is, they're not a child, but they're also not an adult yet. And then in the final stage, the period of reaggregation, the participant re-enters society in a new position. So from child to adult, or from single person to married person, or both of those together. Victor Turner talked about this notion of liminality. And in the context of rites of passage, he noted that there's this symbolic ambiguity that accompanies the period of transition, also known as liminality. We can think about liminality again as the ambiguous transitional state in a rite of passage in which the person or persons undergoing the ritual are outside their ordinary social position. People in this stage develop a community and comradeship with others undergoing the same rite of passage. This is what Victor Turner refers to as communitas. Periods of communitas are transitory, such as the winning moment of a sports team or participating in a mass public event, or in the context of a puberty ritual if you're going through with a group of individuals when the ritual is over. This period of communitas is transitory. Now we think about play and compare this to ritual. We really think about play and ritual as being complementary to one another. They are really based on complementary forms of metacommunication. Play, as I said before, is based on the premise of a metaphor, let's make believe, let's pretend. So you have this idea of inauthenticity. Ritual is based on literalness, basically, let's believe, the truth of this ritual. Ritual typically has a more rigid frame than play and reinforces social rules as well as the status quo. However, ritual and play can overlap in ethnographic examples. You can see this amongst the Yoruba. The Druel writes about this in the context of how gender roles can be transgressed in a ritual context. When we talk about symbolic practices, perhaps one of the most talked about symbolic practices is in the context of religion. Religion can be thought about as ideas and practices that postulate reality beyond that which is immediately available to the senses. Wallace outlined several common categories of religious behavior. First, prayer, a customary way of addressing cosmic forces. Second, physiologic exercise, a method of physically manipulating physiological states. So taking drugs, depriving oneself of water, of sleep, of food, all these sorts of things to reach a different state of consciousness, a different spiritual state. An exhortation given certain individuals who are associated with special relationships with invisible powers, which allow them to give orders, heal, threaten, give comfort, interpret for the interest of others. The notion of mana, or the transmission of superhuman power from object or person to something that does not have this power. Taboo, rules forbidding the touching of certain objects or people, in other words, certain foods at certain times. Feasts, eating or drinking in a religious context, which can be as simple as praying at the start or at the end of the meal. A sacrifice, giving something of value to invisible forces or their agents in thanks to cosmic forces in hopes of influencing them to act in a certain way, or simply to gain general religious merit. When we think about religious organization, some societies formulate channels of contact to invisible cosmic powers, an often complicated process requiring special practitioners who can facilitate the religious rituals. Two specialists of religion are the shaman and the priest. The shaman is a part-time religious practitioner who is believed to have the power to travel to or contact supernatural forces directly on behalf of the individuals or group. Shamans engage in dangerous activity as they enter in and out of altered states of consciousness. Due to their powers to affect positive or negative impacts, shamans can sometimes be viewed with suspicion, placing them in an ambiguous social status. Compare this with priests, who are religious practitioners skilled in the practice of religious rituals, which he or she carries out for the benefit of the group. Priests act as mediators of contact with cosmic forces. Since priests are most commonly found in hierarchical societies, they hold a higher status than those they administer to. E. Evans Pritchard writes about the notion of witchcraft, oracles, and magic amongst the Zande people. and talks about how the Zande may explain unfortunate events and how oracles and magics are used to control people's actions. A general definition of witchcraft is the performance of evil by human beings believed to possess an innate non-human power to do evil, whether or not as an intentional or self-aware. The Zande version of witchcraft is mangu, which is a substance in the body of witches, primarily located in the sternum. It grows over time, so the witch gains more power over time. Also, it's gender specific, so males can influence males, females can influence females. Women attacks against other witches, against women, men against men. Witchcraft was thought to work when a soul of an organ was extracted, causing suffering and disease. And to the Zande, witchcraft was a natural explanation for events including death. However, some misfortunes were due to people breaking taboo rules or other moral rules or being responsible for their own problems. So in the context of something like a collapsing granary, now granaries made of wood, lots of termites eating those, granaries collapse pretty often. When the granaries fall and kill people sitting under it, that is considered witchcraft due to the exact timing that the termites destroy the logs and the structure crumbled. When we think about patterns of witchcraft accusation, this can have a number of different impacts on social cohesion. For Evans Pritchard, witchcraft accusation is a way to maintain social cohesion and correct certain behavior. Mary Douglas looks at this in the context of two different types of witchcraft, both presenting different social functions. Witchcraft done by the outsider will strengthen group ties. Witchcraft done internal or inside the group may weaken group ties, potentially causing the social order to be rearranged. This is particularly true if there's a division within the society over whether this person is a witch or not, or whether they are acting properly or not. In internal witchcraft, if the witch is a dangerous deviant, and the accusation could be a way of defending the values of the community, so just completely everyone in the group or community uniting around the idea that the person is a witch. In the context of the United States, Michael Brown writes about New Age spirituality and channeling, where he looks at altered states of consciousness to contact spirits at different times and dimensions. These channels or practitioners of channeling believe in tapping into the wisdom that comes from the collective unconscious, which includes historical eras, different planets, and dimensions. It's closely related to North American culture as a whole and the notion that individualism, the personal recovery movement, and women-centered spirituality to provide practitioners and followers with meaning coherence and a sense of control over events in what Brown refers to as an anxious age. The theology of channeling, according to Brown, is based on four key assumptions. First, that human beings are in essence gods, immortal, as part of a divine universe, and are in control of their reality. Second, humans undergo several reincarnations from different planets or dimensions, which are essential parts of their learning experiences. Third, every person is responsible for their own reality, and that individual or mass thoughts can initiate change. The idea here is if enough people visualize world peace, then it can happen. An interesting piece by Hagelin in 1998 looks at Washington, D.C. and the idea of transcendental meditation, and there was a mass practice of transcendental meditation for peace in Washington, D.C., and Hagelin shows how during this presentation there was a marked decline in the actual events of violence in Washington, D.C. that could not be explained by any other factor. So sort of perhaps leading to a little bit of evidence for number 3 here, that every person is responsible for their own reality, and that if enough people envision world peace, it can happen. Finally, fourth, the channels and their clients interpret the universe as one interconnected field. Channeling is thought to repair the damage done by Western civilization that has divided the world. In the context of the New Age movement, you also have a lot of folks, individuals within the New Age movement that discuss the notion of being native, being Indian. Smith argues that the New Age movement has greatly trivialized the oppression of Indian people who have undergone years of colonization and genocide. Indian women are often held as these exemplars, considered the bearing of a New Age spirituality. The worldview is that multiple reincarnations, that anyone can essentially become Indian without any regard to the struggles of Indian women. Smith particularly targets feminists who perpetuate this false appropriation of Indian identity without taking the responsibilities that come with being Indian. Finally, Tanya Luhrmann talks about the notion of born-again Christians. In her article, Metakinesis, How God Becomes Intimate in Contemporary U.S. Christianity, Luhrmann traces the history of religious belief in the United States, noting that 66% of baby boomers who were raised in a religious tradition dropped this tradition, and that in 1996, 39% of the population described themselves as evangelical or born-again Christians. In 1999, 96 people said they believed in God or at least some power higher than themselves. A lot of the issues that Luhrmann was talking about with informants was that people tended to intellectually believe in Christ during their childhood. Luhrmann sees a number of factors along the lines of Brown in terms of the anxious age. She sees the rise of media, TV, and the internet, as well as the attenuation of the U.S. relationship as really creating this anxious age. So the rise of media, TV, and internet, basically people become caught up in a fantasy, being distracted from the outside environment. They create a different subjective reality from the fragile one that surrounds us, so people plugging into their iPods, putting those in instead of, and that's their other reality that they go into, these different forms of media. Luhrmann also notes the attenuation of the U.S. relationship through thinner and weaker than in the middle of the last century. She sees this through the decrease in civil engagement, whether this be in terms of parent-teacher associations or participation in elections. Entertainment of friends, which is vanishing overall. When it does happen, it usually happens outside the home. Also a decrease in social capital. More people feel lonely, isolated in isolated living situations. She notes that current statistics, around 25% of the population lives alone. In 1940, it was only 8%, and if we think about the ancestral environment of human beings, it was 0%. So what Luhrmann sees with born-again contemporary U.S. Christianity is that people are really searching for a relationship, and part of this relationship is fulfilled through a close relationship with God to protect them against modern social life, and that there's this sense of participation as well as exchanged, and that through faith, the loneliest of conscious creatures comes to experience themselves in a world awash with love. When we talk about worldviews, sometimes worldviews are altered in order to more closely relate to changing or unstoppable experiences. So we think about this in the context of the Protestant Reformation, which was a result of social and regional changes, breaking ties with the Pope and turning church lands over to state authorities. The movement of migrants in Cameroon from rural to urban settings caused many to adopt a Muslim identity. Sometimes you have this notion of syncretism. Syncretism is the synthesis of old religious practices or an old way of life with new religious practitioners or a new way of life introduced from the outside, often by force. And so you can see a lot of this in the context of Central America, Latin America, and Christianization connected with certain Catholic saints and their own supernatural deities. So even notions of Haitian voodoo or the Sonoran Catholicism present in the Tohono Nation in northern Sonora, Mexico. Anthropologists have studied how groups address radical changes to their social order, i.e., in other words, the imposition of colonial powers, how they rectify these colonial powers coming in. One of the ways that they do this is through revitalization movements, which is a deliberate attempt to create a more satisfying culture, sometimes adopting outside elements. Another approach to this is nativism, or return to the old ways, a movement whose members expect a Messiah or a prophet who will bring them back to a lost golden age of peace, prosperity, and harmony. Worldviews are really instruments of power. Those in power positions are often the ones who impose particular worldviews. Those in subordinate positions may develop alternative worldviews that address their social status. The use of religious symbols may function as the foundation of cultural values, so swearing on the Quran as a method of controlling behavior, for example, or swearing on the Bible in the context of court. Symbols can also be used by certain individuals, such as priests or kings, to affect the behavior of others. The control of sacred knowledge by elders, the different knowledge possessed by men and women, are examples of how power relations can be uneven and altered due to basically who knows what. in summary, when we talk about symbolic practices, we've covered issues of play, art, myth, ritual, religion, and worldview to give you a really broad idea of symbolic practices. In the rest of this section, you guys will be working with specific articles which go into religion and art in more depth, and you can begin to think about how this relates to the overall notion of symbolic practices in the context of play, myth, ritual, and worldview.